In the autumn of 1853, the Magnolia Plantation in Mississippi celebrated its most profitable harvest in decades. Cotton prices had soared to unprecedented heights, and Master Jonathan Whitmore's fields had yielded more than any season before. The great house buzzed with preparations for a victory feast that would host 47 of the most powerful plantation owners in 3 counties. They would gather to toast their prosperity, to celebrate the peculiar institution that had made them wealthy beyond measure, and to plan the expansion of slavery into new territories. But in the plantation kitchen, where the sweet smell of molasses mixed with the acrid scent of wood smoke, a different kind of plan was taking shape. Samuel's massive hands moved with practiced precision as he ground dried oleander petals into powder fine as flour. The mortar and pestle, carved from Mississippi granite, sang a whispered song of death as the toxic flowers surrendered their deadly essence to his patient violence. 43 years of life had scarred those hands with countless burns from cast iron stoves and cuts from butcher knives, but they had never trembled with purpose as they did now. Each grain of poison he created carried the weight of accumulated rage, the crystallized fury of a man who had finally found his moment to balance the scales of cosmic justice. The kitchen stood in pre-dawn darkness, lit only by the flickering flames in the great hearths where tomorrow's feast would be prepared. Shadows danced across the wooden counters like spirits of the wronged, and in those shadows, Samuel saw the faces of everyone he had lost to Master Whitmore's cruelty, his wife Esther's gentle smile, frozen in his memory at the moment before they dragged her to the whipping post, his son Marcus, barely 14, sold downriver to New Orleans like a prize bull, his daughter Ruby, who had simply vanished one night after catching Master Whitmore's attention, leaving behind only a torn dress and questions that no one dared ask aloud. 28 years he had served in this kitchen. 28 years of yes, Master Whitmore, and no, Master Whitmore, while his soul withered like cotton under the merciless sun. He had prepared feasts for celebrations of their prosperity, had cooked elaborate meals for their business meetings where human beings were discussed like livestock, had served delicacies at gatherings where they planned the expansion of slavery into territories that had never known the crack of the overseer's whip. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, the poison would speak for him in a language they would finally understand. The oleander powder accumulated in a small ceramic bowl, catching the firelight like sugar crystals touched by flame. Each grain held the promise of justice, of an ending written not by Master Whitmore's whip, but by Samuel's trembling hands. The harvest feast would begin at sunset, when the great dining room would fill with the cream of Mississippi plantation society. 47 masters of human bondage would gather to toast their success, never suspecting that their celebration would become their final meal, their triumph, their funeral banquet. Samuel had chosen oleander for its perfect cruelty. The flowers grew wild around the plantation grounds, beautiful and innocuous, their pink blossoms a common sight in the gardens that surrounded the great house. No one would suspect their deadly nature, just as no one suspected the deadly intentions of the man who had served them faithfully for nearly 3 decades. The poison worked slowly at first, creating confusion and discomfort that would be attributed to overindulgence in rich food and strong liquor. But as it accumulated in their systems, as the toxic compounds concentrated in their blood, it would deliver a death that was both certain and agonizing. He had tested his theory on the plantation's hunting dogs, watching with scientific detachment as they consumed scraps of meat seasoned with oleander powder. The results had been everything he could have hoped for. The animals had died within hours, their systems overwhelmed by cardiac arrest and respiratory failure. If it worked on dogs, it would work on masters. The principle remained the same, only the scale would change. Through the kitchen window, Samuel could see the first pale hints of dawn touching the eastern horizon. Soon the plantation would stir to life, and the frantic preparations for tonight's feast would begin in earnest. Servants would scurry through the corridors with armloads of china and crystal, while others polished silver and arranged flowers cut from the very gardens where oleander bloomed in deadly profusion. The irony was perfect, Samuel thought. They would dine surrounded by the instrument of their destruction, never suspecting that beauty could mask such lethal purpose. The sound of footsteps on the wooden planks outside warned him of approaching company, and Samuel quickly tucked the ceramic bowl into a hidden compartment he had carved years ago behind the flour barrel. His movements were casual, practiced, the actions of a man who had learned to hide his true thoughts behind a mask of servile compliance. When young Timothy entered to begin his morning duties, Samuel was already working on the bread dough for the day's meals, his massive hands kneading the mixture with the same methodical precision he had used to grind the oleander petals into powder. "Morning, Uncle Samuel," Timothy whispered, using the title of respect that younger slaves accorded their elders. "Master's feast going to be something special tonight. 47 guests, all the way from Natchez and Vicksburg. Jeremiah says it's the biggest gathering this plantation ever seen." Samuel nodded without looking up from his work, though something wild flickered behind his eyes, something that had been building like storm clouds for decades, fed by every humiliation, every loss, every night spent praying for the strength to survive until morning. "Yes, boy," he murmured, his voice steady as his kneading hands. "It surely will be something special, something none of them will ever forget." The bread dough yielded to his touch, elastic and warm, full of potential for transformation. Like the poison hidden behind the flour barrel, it awaited the heat that would change its very nature, that would create something new from simple ingredients. But where the bread would nourish and sustain, the oleander would deliver justice disguised as hospitality, retribution served with elegant presentation on the finest china the plantation could provide. As Timothy bustled about, lighting fires and preparing the kitchen for the day's work, Samuel let his mind drift to the memory that had finally pushed him beyond the breaking point, the morning 3 weeks ago when he had awakened to screams from the direction of the quarters, to the smell of smoke and the sight of flames licking at the sky like the tongues of devils. Master Whitmore had discovered that Esther, Samuel's wife of 25 years, had been teaching slave children to read using a Bible she had hidden beneath their cabin's floorboards. The punishment for such defiance was clearly established by plantation law: death by burning, carried out publicly as a lesson to any other slaves who might harbor similar ambitions. Samuel had been forced to watch, held back by overseers while his wife died screaming his name, her body consumed by flames that seemed to dance with unholy joy at their destructive work. Master Whitmore had stood beside the pyre like a high priest of cruelty, his face serene with satisfaction as he demonstrated the consequences of challenging his absolute authority. "Let this be a lesson," he had announced to the assembled slaves, his voice carrying easily over Esther's dying screams. "Education is a privilege reserved for your betters. When you people start getting ideas above your station, this is what happens. Fire purifies the soul and cleanses the community of corruption." Samuel's hands had clenched into fists as he watched his wife die, but the overseer's grip had been too strong, their whips too close, their guns too ready. He had been forced to stand helpless while his heart turned to ash along with Esther's body, while his love transformed into something harder and sharper than diamond. In that moment, as the flames reached toward heaven carrying his wife's soul, Samuel had made a sacred vow. Master Whitmore would pay for this crime. They all would pay. Every master who had gathered to witness the execution, every plantation owner who had nodded approval at the spectacle of human flesh consumed by fire. The kitchen door swung open again, and this time it was Jeremiah who entered, his usually composed face flushed with the urgency that always accompanied major social events at the plantation. As head house servant, he bore the responsibility of ensuring that every detail of tonight's feast would be perfect, that Master Whitmore's reputation as a gracious host would be enhanced by the excellence of the food and service. "Samuel," he announced, consulting the gold pocket watch that Master Whitmore had given him as a reward for faithful service, "I need to review the menu one final time. 47 guests, all of them expecting a meal worthy of their elevated station. This feast will be discussed in drawing rooms across 3 states. Everything must be flawless." Samuel wiped his flour-dusted hands on his apron and turned to face the head servant, his expression carefully neutral despite the fire burning in his chest. "Yes, Mr. Jeremiah. Everything going to be exactly as it should be. Every dish prepared with special care. Every detail attended to with the respect our guests deserve." There was something in the way he said those words, "every detail attended to with the respect our guests deserve," that made Jeremiah pause and study Samuel's face with sudden attention. But the cook's expression revealed nothing beyond the humble competence that had marked his service for nearly 3 decades. If anything, Samuel seemed more dedicated than usual, more focused on achieving perfection in his culinary artistry. Good," Jeremiah said. though he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something had changed in Samuel's demeanor since Esther's execution. The main course will be roasted suckling pig with your famous cornbread stuffing, supplemented by fried chicken, honey-glazed ham, and those sweet potato casseroles that Master Whitmore prizes so highly. For dessert, I want your legendary peach cobbler and bourbon bread pudding. And of course, we'll need enough portions to satisfy 47 very important appetites. Samuel nodded, already calculating the quantities of oleander powder he would need to ensure that every guest received a fatal dose. The beauty of his plan lay in its simplicity. Rather than trying to poison a single dish that might not be consumed by all the guests, he would contaminate multiple courses, guaranteeing that everyone present would ingest enough toxic compounds to ensure their deaths. The cornbread stuffing, the sweet potato casseroles, the peach cobbler, even the bourbon bread pudding could all be enhanced with his special seasoning without arousing suspicion. Everything be ready on time, Samuel assured Jeremiah, his voice carrying a strange musical quality that made the head servant tilt his head like a man hearing an unfamiliar melody. This feast going to be talked about for generations. Mark my words, Mr. Jeremiah. This dinner going to change everything. As Jeremiah left to attend to other preparations, Samuel retrieved the ceramic bowl from its hiding place and studied the oleander powder with the satisfaction of an artist contemplating his masterpiece. The preparation phase was nearly complete. Soon he would begin the delicate process of incorporating the poison into the various dishes, measuring each dose with the precision of a chemist and the devotion of a priest, performing sacred ritual. The plantation was fully awake now, bustling with activity as servants prepared for the evening's grand celebration. Through the kitchen window, Samuel could see field hands returning from the cotton rows, their backs bent with exhaustion, their hands bloodied from picking bowls under the overseer's watchful eyes. These were his people, the ones who would survive tonight's reckoning, who would wake tomorrow to a world fundamentally changed by his actions. He was doing this for them as much as for Esther, for Marcus, for Ruby, for all the souls who had been ground to dust beneath the wheels of Master Whitmore's prosperity. The irony was exquisite. Tonight, 47 of Mississippi's most powerful plantation owners would gather to celebrate their dominance over human beings they considered property. They would toast their profits, plan their expansion, discuss the subjugation of entire populations as casually as they might discuss the weather. But they would do so while consuming their own deaths, while ingesting justice disguised as hospitality, while partaking of a communion that would transform them from masters into memories. Samuel began assembling the ingredients for the cornbread stuffing, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. Each component would be blessed with oleander powder, each dish consecrated with the crystallized essence of his accumulated rage. The feast would become a funeral banquet, the celebration a wake, the triumph a final defeat administered by the hands they had thought they owned. As he worked, Samuel became aware of a strange phenomenon occurring around him. The oppressive heat that normally made the kitchen nearly unbearable had begun to stabilize, as if his focused purpose was somehow bringing order to the chaos of Mississippi humidity. The air grew clearer, the weight that usually pressed down on everything lifting like a curse being gradually broken. More significantly, he began to sense presences gathering around him, invisible watchers drawn by the approaching moment of reckoning. He couldn't see them yet, but he could feel them, the spirits of everyone who had died under Master Whitmore's reign of terror. Esther was there, her gentle soul finally at peace now that vengeance was at hand. Marcus stood beside her, no longer the frightened boy who had been sold away in chains, but a young man blazing with righteous fury. Ruby danced between them, her laughter like silver bells, her joy at the approaching justice infectious even in its supernatural form. They were all gathering, Samuel realized. Every slave who had died on this plantation, every soul who had been broken on the wheel of Master Whitmore's cruelty, every spirit who had passed into the next world carrying the weight of injustices never addressed, crimes never punished, suffering never acknowledged. They were coming to witness the balancing of accounts, to see their murderer finally face earthly consequences for his sins. The kitchen filled with their whispered voices, a chorus of encouragement that only Samuel could hear. Cook our pain into that food," they murmured in voices like wind through Spanish moss. "Season it with our tears. Make them taste what they made us swallow. Show them that some debts can never be forgiven, some sins never forgotten." Samuel's hands moved with increasing confidence as he began the sacred work of poisoning the feast. Each pinch of oleander powder was a prayer answered, each contaminated dish a step toward cosmic balance. He was no longer merely a slave cook preparing food for his masters. Celebration. He had become an instrument of divine justice, a force of nature as inevitable as hurricanes and floods, as necessary as the tides that cleansed the Mississippi Delta of its accumulated sins. The first dish to receive his special attention was the cornbread stuffing, a recipe he had perfected over decades of service. As he folded the oleander powder into the mixture, Samuel felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening as if chains that had bound his heart for 28 years were finally beginning to break. Each grain of poison disappeared seamlessly into the golden mixture, invisible to casual inspection, but deadly in its concentrated purpose. The sweet potato casseroles came next, their orange surfaces perfect for concealing the pale powder that would transform celebration into catastrophe. Samuel worked with the methodical precision of a chemist, calculating dosages based on the number of guests and the expected consumption patterns. 47 plates would be served tonight, 47 portions of justice disguised as Southern hospitality. As he labored, the spirits pressed closer, their forms growing more distinct with each passing hour. Samuel could almost see them now, translucent figures that wavered in the kitchen's heat like mirages. But their voices were becoming clearer, more urgent. "Make them pay," Esther's spirit whispered, her words sweet as honey and sharp as broken glass. "Make them understand that we were people, not property. Show them that our lives had value, that our deaths demand recompense." The bourbon bread pudding received its lethal enhancement with ceremony befitting a communion sacrament. Samuel folded the oleander powder into the rich custard base with movements that transcended mere cooking, conducting a symphony of retribution that would play its final notes in the dining room of the great house. Each fold of the wooden spoon was a revolution in miniature, each stir a step toward the liberation of his people from the masters who had thought themselves untouchable. By noon, the preparations were complete. Every dish on tonight's menu had been blessed with Samuel's special seasoning, every course enhanced with the crystallized essence of decades of accumulated suffering. The food looked innocent enough, exactly what one would expect from a harvest feast worthy of Mississippi's plantation elite. The cornbread stuffing gleamed golden in its serving dishes, the sweet potato casseroles bubbled with apparent wholesomeness, and the desserts promised pleasure beyond description. But Samuel knew better. He understood exactly what he had created in the oppressive heat of the plantation kitchen, what forces he had set in motion through his careful work. Tonight, when the masters gathered to celebrate their prosperity, they would consume their own destruction. Justice would be served with their finest silver, retribution presented on their most precious china, death disguised as the very hospitality that had built their wealth on the broken backs of enslaved human beings. The afternoon passed in a haze of final preparations and mounting anticipation. Other servants scurried through the kitchen, carrying dishes to warming ovens and arranging presentation pieces for the grand feast. But Samuel moved through it all with the serenity of a man whose life's work was finally approaching completion, whose purpose had been clarified by fire and purified by loss. As evening approached and the first guests began arriving in their gleaming carriages, Samuel took his position at the kitchen's heart, ready to oversee the service of justice disguised as celebration. Through the window, he could see the masters gathering on the great house's veranda, their faces flushed with prosperity and bourbon, their voices raised in congratulations and crude jokes about their human property. Soon, very soon, that laughter would turn to screams, and Master Whitmore's harvest feast would become something very different from what any of them had planned. The spirits were dancing now around the edges of Samuel's vision, their forms growing stronger with each passing moment, their anticipation building toward the crescendo that would transform the plantation forever. The greatest reckoning in Mississippi's history was about to begin, and Samuel stood ready to serve justice with elegant presentation and deadly intent. The great dining room blazed with candlelight from crystal chandeliers as 47 of Mississippi's most powerful plantation owners took their places at the enormous mahogany table. Samuel watched from the kitchen doorway as they settled into their chairs like carrion birds gathering around a feast, their faces flushed with bourbon and prosperity, their voices raised in congratulations for another profitable season, built on the backs of enslaved human beings. Master Jonathan Whitmore sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, his black evening suit immaculate, despite the oppressive Mississippi heat. To his right sat Colonel Marcus Beauregard from the Natchez district, a man whose cruelty had become legendary even among plantation owners known for their harshness. Stories circulated throughout the slave quarters about Beauregard's midnight visits to his breeding farms, where he personally selected which women would bear children to expand his human livestock operation. On Whitmore's left lounged Judge Harrison Caldwell, whose courtroom had become a theater of injustice where enslaved people were tried and executed for crimes as minor as stealing food or looking a white person in the eye. Caldwell's plantation specialized in breaking rebellious slaves who were sold to him by owners who found them troublesome. His methods were whispered about in fearful tones throughout 3 states, involving techniques of psychological torture that left victims alive but spiritually destroyed. Further down the table sat Dr. Thaddeus Morton, whose medical expertise was used to keep slaves productive despite injuries and illnesses that would have hospitalized free men. Morton had perfected surgical techniques for repairing whip damage that allowed overseers to beat slaves nearly to death without permanently reducing their work capacity. His plantation clinic was also where female slaves were subjected to experimental procedures designed to increase fertility and childbearing survival rates. These were not merely wealthy men celebrating a successful harvest. They were architects of human suffering, engineers of a system that reduced people to property, scientists of cruelty who had spent decades perfecting methods of extracting maximum labor from enslaved bodies while maintaining enough control to prevent rebellion. Tonight, they had gathered to plan the expansion of their empire of bondage into new territories, to discuss innovations in slave management, and to celebrate their collective power over hundreds of thousands of human souls. Samuel felt the spirits pressing closer around him as he studied their faces, his phantom companions growing more agitated with each burst of laughter from the dining room. Esther's ghost stood at his shoulder now, her form solid enough that he could make out individual features of the face he had loved for 25 years. Her eyes blazed with righteous fury as she watched the men who had ordered her death sharing jokes and tobacco while they waited for their poisoned feast. "Look at them, Samuel," she whispered, her voice carrying the musical quality that had once filled their cabin with lullabies and work songs. "Look at how they smile while they plan to buy and sell more of our people. Listen to how they laugh while they discuss breeding schedules and punishment techniques. They think they God's husband. They think they untouchable." Around her, other spirits nodded in grim agreement. Old Moses from the cotton fields, who had died from heat exhaustion after being denied water for talking back to an overseer. Young Sarah from the house, who had been beaten to death for breaking a china plate worth more than her life. Little Benjamin, barely 8 years old, who had been sold away from his mother and died of heartbreak before reaching his new master's plantation. They were all here now, every soul who had suffered under the reign of these 47 masters of human bondage. Their phantom forms filled the kitchen like a congregation of the wronged, their whispered voices rising in anticipation of the justice that was finally at hand. Samuel could feel their collective will flowing through him, their accumulated desire for retribution lending strength to his arms and steadiness to his hands. The moment had arrived. Jeremiah appeared at the kitchen doorway, his face glowing with nervous excitement as he prepared to oversee the service of what he believed would be a triumph of culinary artistry. Behind him, a parade of house servants stood ready to carry the feast to the dining room, their arms laden with serving dishes that contained enough oleander poison to fell a regiment. "Samuel," Jeremiah announced, consulting his gold pocket watch with trembling fingers, "Master Whitmore calls for the first course to be served. Everything must be perfect. These are the most important men in 3 states and they expect nothing less than excellence." Samuel nodded, understanding that excellence would indeed be delivered, though not in the form that Jeremiah expected. Each dish had been prepared with meticulous care, every serving enhanced with the crystallized essence of decades of accumulated suffering. The cornbread stuffing gleamed golden in its silver serving bowls. The sweet potato casseroles bubbled with apparent wholesomeness, and the other dishes promised pleasure beyond description. But Samuel alone knew the terrible secret hidden within each appetizing presentation. The oleander powder had been distributed throughout the meal with mathematical precision, calculated to ensure that every guest would consume a fatal dose before the evening ended. Unlike arsenic or strychnine, which worked quickly and obviously, oleander poisoning developed gradually, creating symptoms that would initially be attributed to overindulgence in rich food and strong liquor. The first phase would bring mild discomfort, a slight uneasiness that the masters would dismiss as the natural consequence of eating and drinking too much. But as the toxic compounds accumulated in their bloodstreams, as the cardiac glycosides began interfering with their heart rhythms, the symptoms would escalate rapidly. Nausea and vomiting would be followed by irregular heartbeats, difficulty breathing, and finally cardiac arrest. Death would come within hours, but it would be agonizing, and it would be certain. "Take the cornbread stuffing first," Samuel instructed the waiting servants, his voice steady despite the fire burning in his chest. "Make sure every guest gets a generous portion. Master Whitmore be particularly proud of that recipe. Been perfecting it for 28 years. There was something in the way he said those words, "been perfecting it for 28 years, that made several of the servants exchange uncertain glances. But none of them could identify exactly what felt different about Samuel's demeanor. Couldn't put their finger on the subtle transformation that had taken place in the oppressive heat of the Mississippi kitchen. The servants filed out carrying their deadly cargo, and Samuel positioned himself at the kitchen window where he could observe the dining room through the serving hatch. He watched with the detached fascination of a scientist observing an experiment as the poisoned dishes were placed before the gathered masters. As they began consuming their own destruction with genuine enthusiasm and appreciation, Master Whitmore was the first to taste the cornbread stuffing, taking a generous bite and nodding with satisfaction as the familiar flavors filled his mouth. "Excellent as always, Samuel," he called toward the kitchen, his voice carrying the casual tone of a man acknowledging the good behavior of a favored pet. 28 years of faithful service, and you still managed to surprise me with your culinary artistry." Colonel Beauregard helped himself to a large portion, his cruel mouth curved in appreciation as he savored what he believed was simply exceptional Southern cooking. "Whitmore, you've got the finest kitchen staff in the state," he announced, his words slurred slightly by bourbon. "This stuffing is better than what my wife's cook serves, and she cost me 3 times what you paid for your boy." Judge Caldwell loaded his plate with sweet potato casserole, the bright orange mixture concealing its deadly enhancement beneath layers of butter and brown sugar. "The secret is proper seasoning," he declared with the authority of a man accustomed to making pronouncements on subjects he knew nothing about. "These people have an instinct for flavor that we civilized folk sometimes lack. It's in their nature, like how hunting dogs have instincts we can train but never truly understand." "Doctor." Morton reached for seconds of the cornbread stuffing, his medical training making him particularly appreciative of what he assumed was simply exceptional preparation. "The texture is perfect," he observed, cutting another piece with surgical precision. "Not too dry, not too moist. Your Samuel has achieved an ideal balance that speaks to years of refinement and dedication." Samuel watched them consume their deaths with growing satisfaction, feeling a profound sense of completion that transcended mere revenge. This wasn't simply about killing the men who had destroyed his family, though that was certainly part of it. This was about cosmic balance, about the restoration of natural order that had been perverted by the institution of slavery. These 47 masters had spent their lives treating human beings as property, had built their wealth on suffering and their power on the systematic dehumanization of entire populations. They had convinced themselves that such treatment was justified, that their victims were somehow less than human, that the bonds of family and love that connected enslaved people were somehow weaker and less meaningful than those that connected white families. They had used this manufactured justification to separate mothers from children, husbands from wives, parents from their offspring, one, treating the sale of human beings as casually as the sale of livestock or farming equipment. But tonight, as they consumed the fruits of Samuel's labor, they would learn that their victims had possessed the same capacity for love, the same depth of feeling, the same fierce devotion to family that they claimed for themselves. They would discover that the bonds they had so carelessly severed had been every bit as strong as their own, and that breaking them had consequences that extended beyond their immediate understanding. The spirits were growing more agitated now, their forms becoming increasingly solid as the poison began its work. Samuel could see them clearly, translucent figures that wavered in the dining room's candlelight like heat mirages, but their presence was unmistakable. They moved between the seated masters like serving ghosts, their phantom hands reaching out to touch the men who had ordered their deaths, their whispered voices rising in a chorus of anticipation. "It's starting, Samuel," Esther's spirit observed, her voice carrying a note of wonder that made his heart swell with grim pride. Can you feel it? The way the balance shifting? Your work calling down justice from heaven, making space for truth in a place built on lies. Samuel could indeed feel the change, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the spiritual atmosphere of the plantation. The air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility, with the promise of transformation that had been too long delayed. His poisoned feast was becoming more than an instrument of revenge. It was becoming a catalyst for cosmic correction, a focal point for all the accumulated desire for freedom and justice that had been building among his people for generations. Through the serving hatch, he observed the masters continuing their meal with undiminished enthusiasm. They had moved on to the main courses now, helping themselves to generous portions of honey-glazed ham that had been enhanced with oleander powder, to fried chicken that carried its own deadly seasoning, to vegetables that promised nutrition but delivered destruction. With each bite, they consumed more of the concentrated poison, pushing their systems closer to the point of no return. The conversation at the dinner table had turned to business, as Samuel had known it would. These men didn't gather simply to celebrate their success. They came together to plan future expansions of their empire of bondage, to coordinate their efforts in spreading slavery into new territories, to share innovations in the management and control of human property. The Kansas situation requires our immediate attention, Judge Caldwell was saying, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making legal pronouncements that destroyed lives. If we allow the abolitionists to gain a foothold there, it could threaten the entire expansion of our peculiar institution into the Western territories. Colonel Beauregard nodded grimly, pausing in his consumption of the poisoned ham to gesture with his fork for emphasis. We need to coordinate our political efforts more effectively. The northern states are becoming increasingly hostile to our way of life, and their propaganda is starting to influence public opinion, even in border regions that should naturally support our cause. Dr. Morton reached for more of the sweet potato casserole, unknowingly adding another dose of oleander to his already contaminated system. All the scientific evidence clearly supports our position, he declared with the confidence of a man whose medical degree lent authority to his prejudices. Physiological studies demonstrate conclusively that the African race is naturally suited for labor and submission, while the Caucasian race is designed for leadership and intellectual pursuits. We're not oppressing anyone. We're simply organizing society according to natural law. Master Whitmore raised his wineglass in a toast, the crystal catching candlelight like liquid fire. To the expansion of civilization, he announced, his voice carrying across the dining room with ceremonial gravity. To the proper ordering of society according to divine will, and to the continued prosperity of the system that has made us the wealthiest and most powerful men in the world. Samuel felt bile rise in his throat as he listened to their casual discussions of human bondage, their scientific justifications for treating people as property, their religious claims that God himself had ordained their system of cruelty and exploitation. They spoke of enslaved families as breeding stock, of children as future assets, of elderly slaves as depreciated capital that needed to be disposed of efficiently. Every word was a knife thrust into his soul, every phrase a reminder of why they deserved the fate he had so carefully prepared for them. But even as rage burned within him, Samuel felt a profound sense of peace settling over his consciousness. The work was proceeding exactly as planned. The poison was circulating through their systems, accumulating in their bloodstreams, preparing to deliver the justice that had been denied for far too long. Soon, their casual discussions of human bondage would be interrupted by symptoms they couldn't ignore, by physical manifestations of the spiritual corruption that had consumed their souls. The first signs would be subtle at first, slight nausea, a touch of dizziness that they would attribute to rich food and strong wine. But as the oleander compounds concentrated in their systems, as the cardiac glycosides began interfering with their heart rhythms, the symptoms would escalate beyond anything they could dismiss or ignore. Samuel had calculated the timing carefully, based on his observations of the hunting dogs and his understanding of human physiology, gleaned from decades of treating sick slaves with herbal remedies. The first serious symptoms would begin manifesting within the next hour, just as the masters were settling in for their traditional after-dinner cigars and brandy. The progression would be swift then, inevitable as a Mississippi flood, unstoppable as the tide of justice that had finally found its way to their doorstep. Through the serving hatch, he watched them consuming the dessert course with the same enthusiasm they had shown for the earlier dishes. The peach cobbler disappeared quickly, its sweet exterior concealing the bitter justice within. The bourbon bread pudding was received with particular acclaim, several guests requesting second helpings of what they believed was simply exceptional Southern hospitality. "Samuel outdoes himself year after year," Dr. Morton observed, setting down his spoon with a satisfied sigh. "This bread pudding is absolutely transcendent. I've never tasted anything quite like it." "You never will again," Samuel thought with grim satisfaction. "None of you will ever taste anything again. Tonight, your appetite for cruelty and exploitation will finally be satisfied permanently." The spirits were dancing now around the edges of the dining room, their phantom forms whirling in celebration of justice finally served. Samuel could hear their whispered songs of liberation, could feel their collective joy at witnessing the downfall of the men who had destroyed their lives and scattered their families like leaves before a hurricane. Old Moses clapped his ghostly hands in rhythm with a freedom song that echoed from the quarters, his ancient back finally straight and unbroken by the weight of enforced labor. Young Sarah laughed with the pure delight of vindication, her spirit free from the fear that had marked her final years. Little Benjamin danced between them, his childhood restored by the approaching moment of cosmic balance. "Justice coming to dinner," they sang in voices like wind through Spanish moss. "Justice coming," served up sweet and deadly on the finest china. Master men going to learn today what it feel like to be powerless, going to understand what it mean to have death served to you by hands you thought you owned. The conversation at the dinner table was reaching new levels of casual cruelty as the masters discussed their plans for expanding slavery into new territories. They spoke of human beings as units of production, of children as future assets, of families as breeding populations to be managed for maximum efficiency. Every word was evidence of their spiritual corruption, every phrase a justification for the fate that was even now circulating through their bloodstreams. Samuel checked the kitchen clock, noting that nearly an hour had passed since the first course had been served. If his calculations were correct, the oleander poison would soon begin manifesting its first serious symptoms. The cardiac glycosides would be accumulating in their systems, interfering with their heart rhythms, preparing to deliver the swift and certain death that they had earned through decades of cruelty and exploitation. He positioned himself at the serving hatch where he could observe their faces clearly, waiting for the first signs of distress that would signal the beginning of the end. The greatest reckoning in Mississippi history was about to begin, and Samuel intended to watch every moment of it, to witness the justice that had been too long delayed finally claiming its due from the men who had thought themselves untouchable in their wealth and power. The spirits pressed closer around him, their anticipation building toward the crescendo that would transform the plantation forever, their whispered voices rising in songs of liberation that only he could hear. Soon, very soon, the laughter would turn to screams, and Master Whitmore's harvest feast would become something very different from what any of them had planned. The poison was working its way through their systems like divine judgment made manifest, like the hand of cosmic justice reaching down to balance scales that had been weighted toward evil for far too long. The first sign appeared exactly when Samuel had predicted it would. Colonel Beauregard paused mid-sentence, his hand moving unconsciously to his chest as if trying to massage away a sudden tightness that had settled there like a coiled serpent. His face, which had been flushed with bourbon and self-satisfaction, took on a slightly grayish cast that became more pronounced in the flickering candlelight. "Odd sensation," he muttered, loosening his cravat with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. "Must be the rich food. Haven't eaten this well in months." Samuel watched through the serving hatch with the detached fascination of a scientist observing an experiment, feeling the spirits press closer around him as their anticipation built toward the crescendo they had waited decades to witness. The oleander was beginning its deadly work, the cardiac glycosides accumulating in Beauregard's bloodstream to levels that would soon prove fatal. But the colonel wasn't alone in his discomfort. Dr. Morton had grown noticeably pale, his medical training making him more aware than the others of the subtle changes occurring in his body. His pulse had become irregular, his breathing slightly labored, though he attributed these symptoms to overindulgence rather than poisoning. After all, who would suspect that their gracious host had served them death disguised as Southern hospitality? Judge Caldwell reached for his wine glass with a hand that shook almost imperceptibly. his usually commanding voice taking on a slight wheeze that spoke of respiratory distress. "Remarkable meal, Whitmore," he managed, though each word seemed to require more effort than the last. "Your Samuel has truly outdone himself tonight." Master Whitmore himself was beginning to show signs of the oleander's effects, though his symptoms manifested differently than his guests. Where the others experienced cardiac irregularities and breathing difficulties, his body was responding with waves of nausea that he fought to conceal behind his facade of gracious hospitality. Beads of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the evening coolness, and his usual commanding presence seemed diminished by the growing discomfort that gnawed at his insides like a living thing. "Perhaps we should adjourn to the drawing room for cigars and brandy," he suggested, rising from his chair with movements that were carefully controlled to hide his increasing unsteadiness. The evening air might provide some relief from the heat. The suggestion was met with murmurs of agreement from the assembled masters, though several of them struggled to stand without betraying the weakness that was spreading through their systems like poison ivy through a garden. Samuel watched them file out of the dining room, their usual confident swagger replaced by the uncertain gait of men whose bodies were betraying them in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. But this was only the beginning. The oleander poison worked in stages, each phase more devastating than the last. What they were experiencing now was merely the opening movement of a symphony of destruction that would crescendo over the next several hours. The cardiac glycosides would continue accumulating in their bloodstreams, interfering with their heart rhythms, causing their vital organs to fail in succession. The spirits followed the masters into the drawing room, their phantom forms growing more solid and defined with each passing moment. Samuel could see them clearly now, no longer translucent mirages wavering in the heat, but fully manifested presences that moved among the dying men like angels of vengeance. Esther walked beside Master Whitmore, her gentle face transformed by righteous fury, her ghostly hand reaching out to touch the man who had ordered her death. "Feel it starting, husband," she whispered, her voice carrying the musical quality that had once filled their cabin with songs and laughter. "Feel that tightness in your chest, that burning in your belly. That's what justice tastes like when it finally come calling. That's what we've been waiting for all these years." The other spirits took positions around their respective tormentors, each phantom finding the master who had caused their death or destroyed their families. Old Moses stood behind Colonel Beauregard, his ancient hands hovering over the man who had worked him to death in the cotton fields. Young Sarah positioned herself beside Judge Caldwell, her spirit blazing with the fire of vindication as she watched the man who had sentenced her to death for breaking a china plate. Little Benjamin danced around Dr. Morton, his childhood innocence transformed into an instrument of cosmic justice. In the drawing room, the masters attempted to maintain their usual convivial atmosphere, despite the growing discomfort that plagued them all. Cigars were lit with shaking hands. Brandy was poured into glasses that clinked together in increasingly unsteady toasts. But their conversation had lost its earlier energy. Their laughter sounded forced and hollow, and their eyes held the first glimmers of fear, as they began to realize that something was seriously wrong. "Damned indigestion," Colonel Beauregard complained, pressing his hand against his chest, where his heart was beginning to skip beats in an increasingly erratic rhythm. "Feels like a horse kicked me in the ribs." Dr. Morton's medical training was finally overriding his initial assumption that he was simply experiencing the effects of rich food and strong drink. He checked his own pulse with growing alarm, feeling the irregular heartbeat that spoke of cardiac distress far beyond anything that could be attributed to overindulgence. His breathing had become noticeably labored, each inhalation requiring conscious effort as his respiratory system began to fail under the assault of the oleander toxins. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice tight with growing panic, "I believe we may be experiencing some form of food poisoning. The symptoms are consistent with toxic ingestion rather than simple digestive upset." The words fell into the drawing room like stones into still water, creating ripples of fear that spread outward to encompass the entire gathering. Master Whitmore's face went white as he considered the implications, his mind racing through the evening's menu, trying to identify what could have caused such widespread symptoms among his carefully selected guests. But Samuel knew they would never identify the source of their distress. The oleander powder had been distributed too thoroughly throughout the meal, incorporated into too many different dishes for them to trace it to any single course. More importantly, none of them would ever suspect that their gracious host's faithful kitchen slave had deliberately poisoned their feast. Such an act was beyond their comprehension, outside the boundaries of what they believed possible from people they considered property. Judge Caldwell attempted to stand, perhaps intending to summon medical assistance, but his legs buckled beneath him as his cardiovascular system succumbed to the mounting toxicity in his blood. He collapsed back into his chair with a gasp that sounded like air escaping from a punctured bellows, his face taking on the grayish pallor that marked the advanced stages of oleander poisoning. "Something's wrong?" he wheezed, his usually commanding voice reduced to a desperate whisper. "Something's terribly wrong. I can't breathe properly." The panic was spreading now like wildfire through dry grass, consuming the veneer of civilization that these men had wrapped around themselves to disguise their fundamental brutality. Master Whitmore staggered toward the bell pull that would summon servants, but his coordination was failing as the poison interfered with his nervous system's ability to control his movements. His hands shook violently as he reached for the cord, sweat pouring down his face despite the cool evening air. But even as their bodies betrayed them, even as the oleander poison began its final, devastating assault on their vital organs, the masters couldn't bring themselves to consider the possibility that one of their slaves had orchestrated this catastrophe. Their worldview was too rigid, their assumptions about racial hierarchy too deeply ingrained, for them to accept that someone they considered property had possessed both the intelligence and the will to destroy them so completely. Samuel moved closer to the drawing room doorway, no longer content to observe from the kitchen but drawn by an irresistible need to witness their final moments up close. The spirits accompanied him, their forms now solid as living flesh, their faces blazing with triumph as they watched their murderers receive the justice that had been denied them in life. The scene that greeted him was beyond his most fevered imaginings of revenge. 47 of the most powerful men in Mississippi lay writhing in various stages of oleander poisoning, their bodies convulsing as their hearts struggled to maintain circulation against the mounting toxicity in their blood. Some clutched their chests as cardiac arrhythmias sent lightning bolts of pain through their systems. Others vomited blood as their digestive systems rebelled against the poison they had so eagerly consumed. Colonel Beauregard was among the worst affected, his military bearing completely gone as he curled into a fetal position on the Persian carpet, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps as his respiratory system began to shut down. The man who had overseen the breeding of human beings like livestock, who had personally selected which women would bear children to expand his property holdings, was now reduced to a whimpering animal, begging for mercy from a universe that had finally decided to balance its accounts. Dr. Morton's medical knowledge had become a curse as he realized exactly what was happening to him and his fellow masters. The irregular heartbeat, the respiratory distress, the progressive paralysis of their nervous systems, all pointed to a systematic poisoning that would prove fatal within hours. His attempts to diagnose and treat the condition were hampered by his own failing faculties as the oleander toxins accumulated in his brain, clouding his thoughts and stealing his ability to think clearly. "Digitalis poisoning," he gasped, the words barely audible through the blood that was beginning to fill his throat. "Cardiac glycosides. Someone's killed us all." Judge Caldwell heard the diagnosis through the fog of pain and terror that was consuming his consciousness, understanding dawning in his eyes as he realized that their deaths had been deliberately orchestrated. But even as his legal mind grasped the enormity of what had been done to them, he couldn't bring himself to believe that one of their slaves had possessed the knowledge and capability to carry out such an elaborate murder. "Abolitionists," he wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. "Northern agents. Infiltrated the kitchen, poisoned the food." The irony was perfect in its cruelty. Even as they died from poison administered by the hands of someone they had considered property, these masters of human bondage remained incapable of acknowledging the intelligence and agency of the people they had enslaved. They would rather believe in elaborate conspiracies involving outside agitators than accept that their victims possessed the same capacity for planning and revenge that they claimed for themselves. Master Whitmore finally reached the bell pull and yanked it desperately, though his coordination was so poor that he nearly fell over from the effort. The bells clanging echoed through the great house, summoning servants who would find their masters in the final throes of a justice that had been decades in the making. But Samuel knew that no medical intervention could save them now. The oleander poison had progressed too far, accumulated in too many vital organs, interfered too thoroughly with their cardiac and respiratory functions. The house servants who responded to the bell's summons stopped in the drawing room doorway, their faces reflecting shock and confusion at the scene before them. Jeremiah pushed through the crowd, his usual composure shattered by the sight of 47 of Mississippi's most powerful men writhing in agony on the Persian carpets. His eyes found Samuel standing calm and composed at the edge of the chaos, and something in the cook's expression made the head servant step backward in sudden understanding. "What have you done?" Jeremiah whispered, his voice barely audible above the groans and gasps of the dying masters. "Samuel, what have you done?" Samuel met his gaze with perfect tranquility, allowing Jeremiah to see in his face all the grief and rage and determination that had driven him to this moment of cosmic reckoning. "I served them justice, Mr. Jeremiah," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos surrounding them. "Been cooking it up special for 28 years, ever since they first put chains on my wrists. Tonight, they finally got to taste what they've been feeding us all along." The other servants pressed closer, their faces showing a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension as they realized what their fellow slave had accomplished. Some looked terrified at the implications, understanding that all of them would face terrible retribution once the authorities discovered what had happened. Others showed expressions that bordered on admiration, recognizing that Samuel had achieved something they had all dreamed of but never dared attempt. But Samuel felt no fear as he watched the masters die one by one, their systems shutting down as the oleander poison completed its devastating work. The spirits surrounded him like an honor guard, their phantom voices raised in songs of liberation that filled the drawing room with melodies only he could hear. They had waited so long for this moment, had endured decades of powerless watching while their murderers prospered and planned their futures. Now, finally, they could rest. Master Whitmore was among the last to succumb, his constitution strengthened by years of luxury and medical care that had been denied to the people he enslaved. But even his robust health couldn't withstand the accumulated toxicity that coursed through his veins like liquid fire. He tried to speak, perhaps to curse Samuel or beg for mercy, but only blood emerged from his mouth as his internal organs surrendered to the poison that had been so lovingly prepared in his own kitchen. His eyes found Samuel's across the room, and in them the cook could see the dawning recognition of what had been done and by whose hand. Let him understand in his final moments exactly who had destroyed him and why. Let him die knowing that the people he had considered property had found a way to reach beyond their chains and claim the justice that had been denied them in life. "This is for Esther," Samuel said softly, his words meant for Master Whitmore's ears alone. "For Marcus and Ruby and all the others you murdered in your pride and greed. This is what happens when you push people too far. When you forget that we're human beings with hearts that can break and souls that can rage." Whitmore's mouth moved soundlessly, his vocal cords paralyzed by the advancing toxicity, but his eyes conveyed everything Samuel needed to see. Fear, yes, but also understanding. And beneath that, the terrible recognition that his victims had possessed the same capacity for love and fury that he had claimed exclusively for his own race. In his final moments, he was forced to confront the humanity of the people he had spent his life denying, to acknowledge the depth of suffering he had caused and the justice of the retribution that was claiming his life. Then the light faded from his eyes, and Jonathan Whitmore, master of Magnolia Plantation, joined his fellow masters in death. The drawing room fell silent except for the labored breathing of the few guests who still clung to life, their systems fighting a losing battle against the oleander toxins that would claim them within the hour. Samuel stood perfectly still in the center of the carnage, his heart finally at peace for the first time in 28 years. The work was complete. The accounts were balanced. 47 masters of human bondage would never again tear families apart, never again reduce people to property, never again demonstrate their power through the casual destruction of human lives. The spirits were beginning to fade now, their forms growing translucent as their purpose was fulfilled. Esther's ghost moved toward him one last time, her beautiful face radiant with love and pride, her phantom hand reaching out to caress his cheek with fingers he couldn't feel but somehow sensed. "It's finished, husband," she whispered, her voice growing faint as she prepared to pass into whatever realm awaited beyond this world of suffering and injustice. "The debt's been paid in full. They can't hurt nobody else now. You done what needed doing, Samuel. You done what none of us could do while we lived. You made them pay." Around her, The other spirits nodded their agreement and approval, their whispered voices rising in final songs of liberation before they too began to fade from his perception. They had witnessed the justice they had been denied in life, had seen their murderers receive the retribution that no earthly court would ever have delivered. Now they could rest, knowing that the scales had been balanced and the accounts settled according to divine mathematics that transcended human law. As the last spirit disappeared into the night, Samuel turned and walked calmly toward the kitchen door, stepping over the bodies of men who had once held the power of life and death over him and his people. Behind him, the surviving house servants huddled together in shock, uncertain whether to view him as a hero or a monster, whether to help him escape or turn him over to the authorities who would certainly come looking for answers. But Samuel felt no need to run, no desire to hide from the consequences of his actions. He had accomplished what he set out to do, had delivered justice to those who thought themselves above earthly law, had demonstrated that some debts could never be forgiven, and some crimes could never go unpunished. Whatever happened to him now was of secondary importance compared to the cosmic balance he had restored through his careful work in the plantation kitchen. The dawn that broke over Magnolia Plantation on October 15, 1853, illuminated a scene that would be whispered about in slave quarters across 3 states for generations to come. 47 bodies lay still in the great house's drawing room, their fine evening clothes now funeral shrouds, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and pain that spoke to the agonizing deaths they had endured. The harvest feast that was supposed to celebrate their prosperity had become their last supper. Their moment of greatest triumph transformed into their final defeat. Samuel sat calmly on the kitchen steps as the first rays of sunlight painted the plantation grounds in shades of gold and crimson, watching the chaos unfold with the serene satisfaction of a man whose life's work had finally reached completion. House servants ran frantically between the great house and the quarters, spreading news of the catastrophe that had befallen their masters. Field hands gathered in hushed groups, their voices low but their eyes bright with a mixture of fear and something that dared not yet be called hope. The authorities would arrive soon, Samuel knew. Riders had already been dispatched to summon the sheriff, the coroner, and whatever medical experts could be found to examine the scene and determine what had caused such widespread death among the region's most powerful men. They would conduct their investigation with thoroughness born of shock and outrage, but Samuel felt no concern about their eventual conclusions. Let them search for evidence, let them question witnesses, let them theorize about northern abolitionists and outside agitators. The truth was both simpler and more profound than they could ever imagine. Young Timothy approached hesitantly, his face showing the confusion and fear that marked all the house servants since the discovery of the bodies. "Uncle Samuel," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the morning stillness. "What's going to happen to us now? What's going to happen to the plantation? What's going to happen to you?" Samuel looked at the boy with eyes that held depths of knowledge Timothy couldn't yet fathom, understanding that this young man was witnessing the end of one world and the birth of another. "What's going to happen, child, is what always happens when evil men finally face consequences for their actions. There're going to be confusion and fear and anger. There are going to be people looking for someone to blame, someone to punish. But there are also going to be change, real change. For the first time in longer than anybody can remember, the first official visitors arrived before noon, a contingent of local lawmen and medical practitioners who had been summoned to investigate the unprecedented catastrophe that had befallen Mississippi's plantation elite. Sheriff William Morrison, a man whose own wealth depended on the very system that Samuel had struck such a devastating blow against, surveyed the scene in the drawing room with undisguised horror and growing rage. Dr. Edmund Carlisle, the county's most respected physician, conducted his examination of the bodies with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to determining causes of death. His findings were conclusive and terrifying. All 47 men had died from systematic poisoning, their systems overwhelmed by cardiac glycosides that had caused their hearts to stop and their respiratory systems to fail. The toxin had been delivered through their food, distributed throughout the evening's menu with a precision that spoke to careful planning and intimate knowledge of their dining habits. This was not the work of outside agitators, Dr. Carlisle announced to the assembled investigators, his voice tight with the implications of his discovery. This was an inside operation, carried out by someone with access to the kitchen and detailed knowledge of the evening's menu. someone who knew exactly what these men would eat and when they would eat it. Sheriff Morrison's eyes immediately turned toward the plantation's slave quarters, understanding dawning in his face as he grasped the magnitude of what had occurred. One of Whitmore's own slaves had orchestrated this massacre, had demonstrated a level of intelligence and planning capability that challenged every assumption about racial hierarchy that formed the foundation of their society. The implications were staggering, not just for the investigation, but for the entire system of human bondage that depended on the myth of enslaved people's intellectual inferiority. But even as the evidence pointed unmistakably toward the slave quarters, the investigators found themselves reluctant to pursue the logical conclusion of their findings. The idea that someone they considered property had possessed the knowledge and determination to destroy 47 of the most powerful men in the state was almost too radical to accept. It implied a level of agency and capability among enslaved people that would undermine the very foundations of the peculiar institution. Samuel made no attempt to deny his responsibility when the authorities finally came for him. He stood calmly in the kitchen where he had labored for 28 years, his hands still bearing the scars of countless burns from cast-iron stoves and cuts from butcher knives, and met their accusations with the dignified composure of a man who had finally spoken his truth to power. "Yes," he said simply, when Sheriff Morrison asked if he had poisoned the master's food. "I ground oleander petals into powder and mixed it into every dish they ate. Took me all night to prepare it proper, but I wanted to make sure every one of them got their fair share of what was coming to them." The confession sent shockwaves through the assembled lawmen, confirming their worst fears while simultaneously challenging their fundamental assumptions about the nature of the people they held in bondage. Here was undeniable proof that enslaved individuals possessed the same capacity for complex planning, the same depth of emotion, the same fierce devotion to family that their oppressors claimed exclusively for themselves. "Why?" Sheriff Morrison demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and something that might have been fear. "Why would you do such a thing? Master Whitmore fed you, clothed you, gave you a position of responsibility in his household. You were treated better than most of your kind. Why would you repay his kindness with mass murder?" Samuel's laugh was bitter as Mississippi winter wind, carrying all the accumulated pain of 28 years in bondage, all the grief of a man who had watched his family destroyed by the casual cruelty of those who claimed to own him. "Kindness," he repeated, the word dripping with irony. "You want to know about Master Whitmore's kindness? Come with me to the place where he burned my wife alive for teaching children to read. Let me show you where he sold my son like a prize bull. Let me tell you about my daughter Ruby, who disappeared one night after catching his attention and was never seen again." The sheriff stepped backward as if Samuel's words had physical force, his face paling as he confronted the reality of suffering that had been hidden behind the plantation's facade of genteel prosperity. This was not the simple narrative of faithful slaves and benevolent masters that he had been raised to believe. This was something far more complex and troubling, a story of systematic cruelty and the inevitable consequences of treating human beings as property. "They had it coming," Samuel continued, his voice steady as stone despite the tears that had begun to flow down his weathered cheeks. "Every last one of them. They built their wealth on our backs, their comfort on our suffering, their power on our powerlessness. They thought they could buy and sell us like livestock, separate our families like breeding stock, use our bodies until they broke and then dispose of us like worn-out equipment. Well, last night they learned different. Last night they discovered that we're people, just like them, with the same capacity for love and rage, and the determination to see justice done." The trial that followed would become one of the most controversial legal proceedings in Mississippi's history, exposing the fundamental contradictions at the heart of a society that depended on slavery while maintaining the fiction that enslaved people lacked the intellectual capacity for complex thought and planning. Samuel's defense attorney, a young man named Marcus Beaumont, whose own conscience had been troubled by the institution he had been raised to accept, argued that his client's actions were the inevitable result of a system that denied basic humanity to an entire race of people. "Gentlemen of the jury," Beaumont declared in his closing argument, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom where curious spectators had gathered to witness this unprecedented case. "You have heard testimony that Samuel planned and executed one of the most sophisticated poisoning schemes in American history. You have heard evidence that he possessed detailed knowledge of toxic plants, that he calculated dosages with mathematical precision, i.e. that he distributed his deadly preparations throughout multiple courses to ensure maximum effectiveness. The defense attorney paused, allowing the implications of his words to sink into the minds of jurors who had never been forced to confront the reality of enslaved people's intellectual capabilities. I submit to you that such planning requires intelligence, education, and emotional sophistication that directly contradicts every justification for the system of bondage that brought us to this tragic moment. If Samuel possessed the mental capacity to orchestrate such an elaborate crime, then he also possessed the capacity to love his wife, to grieve for his children, to suffer under the weight of injustices that would drive any man to desperate action. But the jury, composed entirely of white men whose own wealth depended on slave labor, could not bring themselves to accept the full implications of Samuel's actions. To acknowledge his intellectual equality would be to undermine the entire foundation of their society, to admit that they had spent their lives participating in a system of cruelty that had no moral justification beyond raw power and economic convenience. The verdict was predetermined by the social and economic forces that shaped Mississippi society. In 1853, Samuel was found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to death by hanging, his execution scheduled for the first Friday in December. But even as they condemned him, the jurors could not escape the troubling questions his case had raised about the nature of the people they held in bondage and the justice of the system that had created such desperate circumstances. Word of Samuel's deed spread through the slave quarters of the Deep South like wildfire, carried by the invisible network of communication that connected enslaved communities across state lines. The story grew in the telling, taking on mythic proportions as it passed from plantation to plantation, inspiring some and terrifying others with its demonstration that resistance was possible, that even the most powerful masters were vulnerable to the determination of those they sought to control. In the quarters, Samuel became a folk hero, his name whispered with reverence around cooking fires and in the hidden spaces where enslaved people gathered to share news and stories. Songs were composed about his deed, coded spirituals that celebrated justice while appearing to speak only of biblical themes. Children who would grow up to see the end of slavery learned his story as a lesson about the power of resistance, about the importance of standing up to oppression even when the cost seemed insurmountable. But his legend also served as a warning to plantation owners throughout the region, a reminder that their assumed safety depended entirely on the willingness of their slaves to accept their bondage passively. The 47 deaths at Magnolia Plantation proved that such acceptance could never be taken for granted, that beneath the surface compliance lurked depths of resentment and capability that could erupt without warning into devastating violence. Security measures were tightened on plantations across 3 states. Kitchen slaves were watched more carefully. Food tasters were employed for important occasions, and restrictions were placed on enslaved people's access to gardens where toxic plants might grow. But these precautions could not address the fundamental problem that Samuel's actions had exposed: the impossibility of permanently suppressing the human spirit, the inevitable tendency of oppressed people to resist their oppression through whatever means were available to them. Samuel himself spent his final weeks in the county jail with the same calm dignity that had marked his confession and trial. Visitors who came to see the man who had shocked the South with his deadly feast found not the savage they expected, but a quiet, thoughtful individual who spoke eloquently about the forces that had driven him to such extreme action. He expressed no regret for what he had done, only sadness that it had taken such drastic measures to draw attention to the suffering of his people. "I'm not proud of taking life," he told one visitor, a journalist from New Orleans who had come to interview the man behind the massacre. "But I'm not ashamed of it either. Those men spent their lives destroying families, breaking hearts, grinding souls into dust for the sake of profit. They created the circumstances that made my actions necessary. If they wanted to live in peace, they should have given peace to others." The execution drew crowds from throughout the region, curiosity seekers and plantation owners who wanted to witness the final chapter in a story that had challenged their understanding of the people they held in bondage. Samuel walked to the gallows with steady steps, his head held high, refusing the traditional hood that would have hidden his face from the assembled spectators. He wanted them to see him clearly, to remember the humanity they had tried so hard to deny. His final words, spoken just before the trapdoor opened, would be remembered and repeated in slave quarters for generations to come. I die knowing that I struck a blow for freedom that will echo through time. The masters are gone, but the people they tried to break are still here, still strong, still fighting for the justice that belongs to all of God's children. The immediate aftermath of Samuel's execution was marked by increased tensions throughout the plantation districts of Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Slave owners who had felt secure in their power now lived with the knowledge that their kitchen staff, their house servants, even their most trusted workers might harbor resentments deep enough to motivate deadly action. The psychological impact of the Magnolia Plantation massacre extended far beyond the 47 men who had died that October evening. But the broader historical significance of Samuel's actions would not become clear until the tumultuous years that followed. The story of the cook who had poisoned his masters became part of the growing body of evidence that enslaved people possessed the same intellectual and emotional capacities as their oppressors, contributing to the shifting attitudes that would eventually make the Civil War and emancipation possible. Abolitionists in the North seized upon Samuel's case as proof that slavery corrupted both enslaver and enslaved, creating conditions of desperate brutality that inevitably led to violence. Frederick Douglass himself wrote about the Magnolia Plantation massacre, arguing that Samuel's actions demonstrated the fundamental impossibility of holding human beings in permanent bondage against their will. When we read of Samuel's terrible deed, Douglass wrote in his newspaper, we must ask ourselves what drove a man to such extremes. Was it inherent savagery, as his accusers claim, or was it the savage treatment he received at the hands of those who claimed ownership over his body and soul? The answer seems clear to any honest observer. Slavery corrupts everything it touches, creating cycles of violence that can only be broken by the complete abolition of human bondage. The plantation system itself was shaken by the implications of Samuel's actions. Insurance companies began charging higher premiums to cover slave owners against similar attacks, recognizing that the assumed docility of enslaved populations could no longer be taken for granted. Some plantation owners invested heavily in security measures, while others began questioning whether the economic benefits of slave labor were worth the psychological costs of living in constant fear of their own workers. In the slave quarters, Samuel's legacy lived on in songs, stories, and whispered conversations that passed his tale from generation to generation. Children born after his execution grew up knowing his name, understanding that resistance was possible even under the most oppressive circumstances. His example inspired other acts of defiance, some subtle, some dramatic, all contributing to the growing pressure that would eventually shatter the chains of bondage forever. The Civil War, when it came, would vindicate Samuel's belief that the system of slavery contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The enslaved people who fled to Union lines, who served as soldiers and spies against their former masters, who celebrated in the streets when news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached their communities, were the spiritual descendants of the man who had served justice with oleander powder and righteous fury. Today, more than a century and a half after that fateful October evening, Samuel's story stands as a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit. His actions remind us that oppression, no matter how complete it may seem, can never fully extinguish the desire for justice and freedom that burns in every human heart. The 47 masters who died at Magnolia Plantation thought they had created a system that would last forever, but they failed to account for the determination of people like Samuel who refused to accept their assigned place in a hierarchy built on cruelty and greed. The cook who ground oleander petals into powder in the pre-dawn darkness of a Mississippi kitchen had no way of knowing that his actions would become part of a larger movement toward freedom and justice. He acted not as a political revolutionary, but as a man pushed beyond endurance, a husband grieving his murdered wife, a father robbed of his children. Yet his personal quest for vengeance became part of the collective struggle that would eventually break the chains that bound millions of his people. Samuel's legacy is complex and troubling, a reminder that the fight for justice sometimes requires actions that challenge our comfortable assumptions about right and wrong. His story forces us to confront difficult questions about the nature of resistance, the limits of moral authority, and the terrible prices that are sometimes paid in the struggle between oppression and freedom. But it also stands as proof that no system of domination, no matter how powerful or entrenched, can permanently suppress the human desire for dignity and justice. The Magnolia Plantation Massacre of 1853 reminds us that history is shaped not just by the actions of the powerful, but by the desperate courage of those who refuse to accept their oppression quietly. Samuel may have died at the end of a rope, but his spirit lived on in every enslaved person who dared to dream of freedom, in every abolitionist who worked to break the chains of bondage, in every Union soldier who fought to preserve a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal. His story challenges us to remember that freedom is never given freely by those in power, but must be demanded, fought for, and sometimes died for by those who dare to dream of a better world. The cook who served justice with oleander powder understood this truth in the depths of his soul, and his actions echo down through history as a reminder that the arc of the moral universe, however long, bends inexorably toward justice. So, what's your take on all this? Do you think Samuel's actions were justified given the brutal system he was fighting against? Or do you believe there could have been another path to justice for him and his people? If you found this story of resistance and courage compelling, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We explore the hidden histories of those who fought against oppression every week, bringing you the stories that mainstream history often overlooks. And if you think others should know about Samuel's remarkable act of defiance, share this video with them. Help us spread the word about the forgotten heroes who shaped our world through their courage and determination to never give up the fight for justice.